Well, in the second lecture, I want to come at the same kind of questions that I was addressing in the first, but from a slightly different angle. I've called the lecture the Faustian bargain for reasons that I'll come to in a few moments, but just to lay out the background, I want to suggest that we could say that the problems we face today, the problems I outlined in the first lecture, represent an era of anthropological crisis. I'm going to return to this in the fourth lecture, but different periods of church history present or indicate that the church faces different theological challenges. And I think the theological challenge of our day, of our generation, is the question of anthropology. We're very, I would say almost distracted, perhaps mesmerized might be another word, by the problematic nature of the question, what is a woman? But I think the question, what is a woman, rests upon deeper confusion about what it means to be a human being. And the time in which we live has raised that question in an acute form. It is now over 80 years. It was 1943 when C.S. Lewis delivered the short series of lectures that later became his great little book, The Abolition of Man. The Abolition of Man, I think, fits into that category of books that has proved to be more true in the generations since it was first written than the author could possibly have known at the time. Every now and then you come across a book that you read today and you think it could have been written yesterday because it puts its finger on so many of the issues we face today. And I put The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis very much in that category. If you have not read it, I would say it's a very, very important, if not vital book to read in our current cultural moment. So we live in an era of anthropological crisis. What characterizes that anthropological crisis? Well, I would suggest a couple of broad features, one of which I alluded to a couple of times in the first lecture, that we increasingly think of ourselves because of the liquid nature of the world in which we live. We increasingly think of ourselves as isolated and autonomous selves. We tend to think of ourselves as those who are self-determining and defined not by our obligations, not by our dependencies, but by freedom. It was actually last year I was rereading an essay that the great English Christian ethicist Oliver O'Donovan wrote on the abortion debates of the 60s and 70s. And he made a very interesting comment in his reflections. He was actually writing this essay in the 1980s, reflecting on the 60s and 70s. He says that the argument that won the abortion debate was an argument that he had considered so weak at the time, he hadn't even bothered addressing it. The argument was that the baby in the womb was merely part of the woman's body. And O'Donovan commenting in the 1980s, he said he thought at the time that argument was so weak and insubstantial, it wasn't even worth addressing. And then he asked the question, so why was it the argument that proved the strongest? He doesn't use Charles Taylor's language, but he essentially says it was the argument that resonated with the imagination. That by the time we hit the 1960s, people think of themselves as free and autonomous. And anything and anyone that impinges on that freedom or that autonomy is a problem to be overcome. Hence, when the woman gets pregnant, she doesn't want to be pregnant, the baby in the womb is a problem to be dealt with, not a person to whom one feels obliged. The myth of the modern self is that of isolation and autonomy. And that brings me to the topic of this lecture. Again, building off the first lecture, how have we come to this situation? Well, a large part of this is technological. The shift from 1248 to 1522 cannot be understood without technological developments. The printing press has to intervene in that time period. Well, that continues down to the present day. I alluded, albeit briefly, towards the end of the last lecture in how new technologies have continued to undermine, shatter, break down old patterns and ways of thinking. Technology plays a very significant role. It will play a role in the lecture I'm going to give now and in the first lecture tomorrow. I might summarize tomorrow's lecture by saying, technology makes the idea that we have limits and ends over which we have no control to be highly problematic. We're going to come to that in tomorrow's lecture. First of all, though, I want to speak in more general terms about the technological transformation of what it means to be a human being. I called it the Faustian bargain. I draw that because of a speech that is made in Goethe's great drama, Dr. Faust. You will all no doubt be familiar with the Faust legend. The medieval alchemist, Dr. Faust, is tempted by Mephistopheles, this demon, to trade his soul for tremendous scientific knowledge and brilliance. There are various versions of this legend, but I think artistically and culturally, the most brilliant is that of Goethe, early 19th century. And when you reread Goethe's Faust, so many, at least of the early speeches of Mephistopheles, capture attitudes that are now deep-seated in our culture. And one of the first speeches Mephistopheles makes when he approaches Dr. Faustus concerns technology. Mephistopheles is trying to tempt Faustus to sell his soul. And at one point he declares this: "My dear sir," this is Mephistopheles addressing Faustus, "my dear sir, you're looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it! You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it?" And then comes the really significant statement. Mephistopheles says this: "If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs." What is Mephistopheles saying to Faust there? If I have a coach and six, it's a coach pulled by 6 horses. 6 horses will have 24 legs. Is it not as if I myself had 24 legs? Notice what Mephistopheles is doing there. I would suggest he's presenting Faustus with the temptation of technology. You can overcome yourself and your limits through the use of technology. We might cast this in another way. We might say that technology tempts us to see the world as raw material over which we can exert our willpower. And it tempts us to see ourselves as something to be transcended. In the language of tomorrow's lecture, I might say, it tempts us to see given limits and given ends as problems to be overcome, not as guideposts to be accepted. So, technology then. What is the promise of technology? I think technology promises us power and liberation. That's what Faust is presented with there by Mephistopheles. You don't need to be limited by 2 legs. If you have a coach and 6, you can have 24 legs. You can be powerful. You can be free. Think of how much of the sales rhetoric surrounding technology is the rhetoric of liberation and freedom. I'm old enough to have started my academic career before email was a thing. I remember when email was being sold to the faculty at the University of Nottingham in the early 1990s. It's going to be fantastic. You don't have to mail letters anymore. Your correspondence will be there when you arrive in the morning. You can deal with your emails first thing. 10 minutes later, the rest of the day is free. You are liberated. The language of liberation. Think of the reality. Email has not liberated us so much as it has imposed a deeper bondage upon us. Now, that's not to say that it isn't a wholly bad thing. I quite like, particularly as an immigrant in the United States, I like being able to communicate in a fast and efficient way with my relatives and loved ones who are thousands of miles away. I'd have to mail them a letter that takes 3 weeks to get there, if it gets there at all. I can now send a text or an email very, very quickly. But it is to say that email has not been liberating. Email has not been liberating in the way that it should be. How difficult is it now to draw that line that was so easy for my father to draw between time spent at work and time at home with family? Very hard to do that. Now, when you think about technology in this way, I would suggest this. Technology does not simply allow us to do the same stuff, only faster and more efficiently. It fundamentally shifts how we think about the world and changes the stuff we do. It affects our imagination. It affects our imagination. Say the students, next time they're frustrated because Google goes down or Spotify isn't working, they need to remember that they only feel that frustration because Spotify and Google exist in the first place. The way they think about what the world should be like has been fundamentally shifted by the technology they have available. More significantly, for the topics of discussion in this conference, it transforms what we think about what it means to be a human being. Now, there are complications here. There are grey areas that I will allude to later on. But let me just make a few sort of, I would say, somewhat simplistic points that I will then go back to qualify later on. First of all, technology, as I said earlier, tilts us towards thinking of the world as raw material. I'm going to return to this figure again, I think, tomorrow. But there is a famous essay written by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger in the 1950s. Heidegger was trying to rehabilitate his reputation. He had a most unpleasant history during the Nazi period in Germany, which really shattered his reputation. So in the 1950s, he decides to sort of behave himself and try to produce philosophical essays that are a little bit more accessible to the general public and are touching on themes of perennial interest. And the most important of them, in English, the title is The Question Concerning Technology. I think it is the only thing I've ever read by Heidegger that I vaguely understand in any way, shape, or form. It's mostly opaque stuff. I think I understand 40% of this essay. That's a pretty good result on anything written by Heidegger. Heidegger talks in the middle of this essay about the difference between bridges and dams. He draws this picture of a river. And he says there are a couple of things, a couple of ways one can respond to the river. One could respond by building a bridge over it so that you can cross from one side to the other. Or, He said you can respond by damming the river up to generate hydroelectric power. Then he goes on to reflect upon the different ways of thinking about the river that those two responses reflect. And if I'm getting him correct, which is always a question when you're dealing with somebody like Heidegger, but it seems to me what he's trying to say is this: the bridge respects the river as river. It acknowledges the river's reality, it accepts its authority, it subverts it a little by providing you with a quick way to get across, but the river remains intact as a river, not only in reality, but in the imagination of the people who build the bridge. But he says, but if you dam the river up for hydroelectric power, you're no longer seeing the river as a river. You're thinking of it as raw material that allows you to do something totally unconnected to rivers. You're not so much respecting the river at that point as demanding that it serves your purposes totally unconnected to its existence as a river. And what he's getting at there in this essay is this, and that he's getting at the imaginative impact of technology. There is technology that acknowledges realities and respects them, and there are technologies that seek to transform or transcend those realities. I'm going to come back to that in a few moments. I think particularly we see this in the realm of medical science, actually, today. But hold that in your mind, the difference between respecting the environment in the way one operates and attempting to transcend the environment in the way one operates. And then finally in this section, the promised reality of technology, just reiterate again. Technology often promises us power and then renders us powerless. I love driving stick shift cars. They can be hard to get hold of in the United States. Why do I love stick shift cars? They're so basic. My dream car would be a 1965 Shelby Cobra. I think they go for $750,000 online. My wife will not allow me to remortgage the house to buy one. She has a lack of vision, I think. But what's the great thing about a Shelby Cobra? It's just a beautiful engine inside a beautiful shell of metal with a stick. There's almost nothing that can go wrong with that car. My wife did allow me, I drive a little red sports car these days. Stick shift. There's even a computer to tell me when to change gears. I hate it. I totally ignore it. Gear changes are a matter of judgment and skill. Nothing to do with algorithms whatsoever. But the problem with my car today is it does all of these different kind of things. And if any one of them goes wrong, the car's rendered completely powerless. The windows go wrong, the car won't start. Technology has promised me liberation of the road and has rendered me powerless. It's also, by the way I love bicycles. Love to see all the bicycles in the Netherlands. I ride my bike all the time in Western Pennsylvania. The bike is a perfect example, I think, of which Heidegger would approve of, because it's technology that allows you to move faster, but you're still aware of the environment and the world around. When you're going up a hill, you feel it. You still have to acknowledge the reality of the environment in some way. That's just a rant on sports cars and bikes. Let's get back to the next section. Technological transformation of man. Now, I'm going to culminate in this section by talking about how technologies transform things like medicine. Which is connected, of course, to how we understand sex, sexual behavior, gender, etc., etc. But as I said in the first lecture, one of the dangers is, when we come at this as Christians, is we jump straight to the symptoms and we fail to see that we are actually part of the overall culture that has created the symptoms. So I want to start by talking about something that you may not have reflected on. as a technology that has transformed how we experience the world and how we think about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a human. It was about 1.5 years ago, I was giving a lecture similar to this at a college in the United States, and protesters turned up to protest me. They're very polite. I have no complaints about them. They were very polite protesters. We got on kind of well, I thought, actually. But I thought, when I saw them in the audience, I thought, I'm going to change the order of topics here to completely wrong foot these people. They think I'm going to start off with transgender stuff. I'm not going to start off with transgender stuff. I thought, I'm going to start off with music. I want us to think about the way music has changed over the years, both reflects and helps constitute a different way of thinking about what it means to be a human being. Now remember, I said at the heart of the modern understanding of what it means to be human is, it's a fairly minimal thing now. We're free, autonomous, and unencumbered. Now let's think about how music plays into that. I am not familiar with every culture on the face of the planet, but every culture with which I am familiar has historically assigned an important role to music. And that role has typically been a communal one. Music seems to me to exist, or to originally have existed, for the celebration or the coming together of a community at key events in community experience. Births celebrated by music. Deaths lamented by music. If you think of American music, the African American spiritual tradition, what is it? It is music developed by a community to give corporate voice to their unique sufferings as a community. Think of the Psalms in the Old Testament. What are the Psalms? Well, many of them, of course, are Psalms of exile. Psalms to be sung corporately by the people of Israel to give words to their deep experience of exile. And when you think about music and words, isn't it interesting? Prose will get you so far in expressing experiences. Poetry will take you further. But words attached to music often have a peculiar power to them. I'm a huge Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett fan. It's funny when a tune starts to play, I know the lyrics off by heart. I've never sat down and learned them. I've just listened to a lot of Frank Sinatra over the years. So the words are embedded in my head in a way that speeches, sermons, etc., are not embedded in quite the same way. Music has a powerful impact. So music is a powerful thing. Now think about music today. Well, let's compare it with 200 years ago. 200 years ago, music had to be communal. If you wanted to experience music, you'd really got to be part of a group producing it, or you had to be in a context in which there was a group producing it. Music was always necessarily a communal thing. You might practice on your own, I guess. But by and large, music was always communal. Its form, we might say, reflected its purpose. It had a communal purpose, and its form was inextricably communal. Had to be. There was no way of, as we would say now, recording music and storing it. It had to be live. Now think about how we experience music today. Most of us, if not all of us in this room, I'm guessing, enjoy music. And I'm guessing that most of us enjoy it almost all of the time as an individual thing. We listen to it in the car, or we put our earbuds in at the gym and we listen to it at the gym. Or I'm always relieved when I get on a plane and if I'm not sitting next to my wife, the person next to me puts their earbuds in. Because I'm a sort of introverted, or put it more rudely, antisocial sort of guy. And it means good. They're going to listen to music. I don't have to talk to them. I can get on and read my book. We consume music individually now. We might say music has gone from being something that was a matter of communal production to something that is now a matter of individual consumption. Think about that. It's hard to articulate precisely the significance of that. But it seems to me it has to be significant, and it has to change the way we think about ourselves and the world if that which existed for the promotion, the constitution, the strengthening of community flips to become that which actually divides us from each other. And when you think about it, music has become increasingly a matter of autonomous individual consumption. Now, you can choose. When I was young, you play an album, you kind of had to listen to the tracks in the order they were on the record, or risk scratching the record. So you could have these things. Young people here probably never heard of them. We call them concept albums, which were meant to be listened to in a certain order. Now you can listen to music in any order you choose. Think about how that shift on music cultivates and reinforces a sense of autonomy. You become the consumer. You become king. Music becomes an individual thing. You consume it individually in a way that in the past it would draw you all together. And that's an important point. I'm going to pick that up in my fourth lecture. So one of the things I'm going to go to in the fourth lecture is, I don't think communal singing in church is a trivial thing. I think communal singing in church is part of the answer, because it actually reminds us of what music was really meant to do. You could make the same statement about dancing. Think about Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice. Think about Mr. Darcy dancing with the Bennet girls. Those dance scenes in the BBC drama. If you were able to sort of erase everybody but Mr. Darcy from that section of the video and look at Mr. Darcy dancing, he'd look ridiculous. Why? Because dancing is a corporate thing, communal thing there. Each individual only makes sense if everybody else in the troupe is doing what they are meant to be doing at that moment in time. Dancing was typically a communal thing. You move to the 19th century, we have the development of the waltz and the foxtrot. There it's one guy and one girl coordinating with each other. Now you move to, I don't know, Saturday Night Fever. John Travolta. To me, that's a recent movie. Some other people here, it's like as long ago as Laurel and Hardy or something. What is dancing in Saturday Night Fever? It's a mating ritual. John Travolta is out dancing the other guys to win the girl. And his dance moves are determined by him, not by any need to coordinate with others. In fact, we might say dancing has become an adversarial thing, not a communal thing at that point. So think about that. Music, the shifting technology in music is not incidental to the shifting technology in how we think about ourselves. Hard to quantify, hard to express with precision. But again, I would say, if something that was very, very important to the formation and the sustaining of communities becomes something that is primarily a matter of individual choice and consumption, something very significant is being lost or transformed within society. Secondly, you can think about this. Think about sexual morality and technology. The way most people think about sexual morality today in the world around us, it's harmless recreation. There is a somewhat contradictory position on the idea of sex is harmless recreation, but sexual assault is much more serious than other kinds of assault. That's a question for another day. Maybe you could ask that question in the discussion this afternoon. But let's just take it at the moment that the modern philosophy of sex is it's a matter of individual expression, and it's a fairly trivial thing in many ways. It has no intrinsic moral significance. You can only do that in a technological world. Think about the middle 19th century. A young man wants to sleep with a young girl. What does he have to do? Well, I would say in the normal run of things, he has to be clean, he has to have a job, and he has to be willing to commit. Because if he's not clean, he's not going to attract a girl. If he doesn't have a job, he's not going to impress her parents. And if he's not willing to marry her, his personal actions, sexual actions, will carry significant social consequences. Probably for him, certainly for the girl and the girl's family. In that kind of world, you cannot imagine sex as a trivial activity. The only people who can do that, in fact, are, for example, the British royal family, where you have sufficient money to be able to compensate for the problems that profligate sexual behavior will create. When Edward VII was, you could get away with this in the early 20th century, when Edward VII was crowned King of England, they actually had a separate box in Westminster Abbey for all of his mistresses to sit in. You couldn't get away with that now. But we know that throughout history, those with the money and power to get away with stuff have generally got away with stuff. For ordinary people, that way of life is not a practically imaginable possibility. Shift to the present, of course. What do we have today? Well, easy access to contraceptives, easy access to antibiotics. So the medical consequences of sleeping around are dramatically reduced. In that kind of world, two things occur. One, the economic and social rationale for Christian morality fades away. Christian morality no longer makes sense because if you don't follow Christian morality, you end up with chaos. No, we're able to avoid the chaotic consequences, at least we think we can, through easy access to contraceptives, later abortion, and antibiotics. Secondly, it becomes possible to imagine sexual activity as recreational. We're going to return to this tomorrow because it connects to the notion of ends, teleology, that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. We get that supercharged, I think, with the advent of internet pornography. What does internet pornography do? Well, it not only stimulates lust, which of course is condemned by Lord Jesus Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. It also preaches a particular philosophy of what it means to be a human being. In some ways it's consonant with that understanding of human beings as autonomous. Pornography teaches us that other human beings exist merely for our benefit. To use the language of the philosopher Roger Scruton, what does pornography do? It changes faces into bodies. What does he mean by that? It destroys the idea of the uniqueness of a particular human sexual relationship and replaces it with a general relationship determined by pleasure, in which the individual person is not particularly significant. I use this to get the students to understand this in class. I make the comment typically that on the day of the wedding, the groom wants to marry a particular woman. He won't be satisfied with a substitute, nor will the woman be satisfied with a substitute. They want to marry a face, a person. When we're taught that sex is just about casual encounters, the person does not matter so much. The person's value is simply determined by the pleasure they can provide one with in a one-night stand. So sex is transformed by technology, because technology makes it, at least in the imagination, a safe activity that can be engaged in without consequences. Third transformation, gender. Remember, when technology starts to teach us to think about the world as raw material, I would say the latest iteration of that is what? It's thinking about the body as raw material. The body becomes raw material for self-construction. Now, let me qualify what I'm going to say here at the start by saying this is not to belittle the suffering of anybody who's struggling with gender dysphoria. I don't wish to belittle the very real experience of that many gender dysphoric people have. But it is to say that the diagnosis and the understanding of gender dysphoria is shaped by the technological world in which we live. Example would be 200 years ago, if you go to the doctor and say to your doctor, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, the doctor would likely say, that's a problem. It's a problem of the mind. We need to work on your mind so that your mind becomes comfortable with your body. That would not be the answer today. Today, the answer, in some places almost legally enforced, would be the doctor has to say, that's a problem of the body. We need to work on the body to bring it into conformity with the mind. Think about it. There's an imaginative shift between those two things. And the imaginative shift is this. In the former, the body has authority. In the latter, the body is a problem. The body becomes raw material to be transformed. Why do we think about gender dysphoria the way we do today? Because of the technology at our disposal. We think the technology can overcome the problem that is the body. I'll speak more about that tomorrow. I think that too connects to the loss of teleology in our understanding of what it means to be a human being. Think about how the internet shapes interactions. The disembodied nature of the internet, I think, militates against us understanding our bodies as being important. Disembodied interaction leads to a reductive notion of personhood. I don't do X, Twitter as it used to be known. What interests me about discussions on Twitter is this. The temperature usually goes up. The temperature quickly seems to me to move in a very hot, angry kind of direction. Debating is not my strong point. I'm not a great thinker on my feet in a debate. I've been involved in a handful of debates during my time, all in person. What has struck me about my in-person debates is this. Temperature has generally gone down. Why? Because bodies are involved. You can smile, you can laugh, you can whisper something to your opponent when he sits down. It's harder to attack somebody when they're sitting on stage with you. There is a natural reserve that kicks in at that point. Not always, but often. Because bodies send out all kinds of signals that are important for human interaction, that are lost in online interaction. When your primary means of engaging other people is online, that will shift your way of thinking about the significance of the human body. Too early to say how and to what extent, but I think we can already safely say it does shift that understanding. Think of medicine. Again, dealing with this very, very briefly. Plastic surgery. As far as I'm able to see, most cultures have had a form of plastic surgery for thousands of years. You go back to the ancient world and there are primitive forms of nose operations, rhinoplasties. Modern plastic surgery really becomes an important thing in medicine after the First World War. In Britain, when you have a generation of young men returning from the trenches whose bodies have been horribly mutilated by trench warfare, fire, gas, bombs, etc., etc. And plastic surgery develops as a way of trying to restore some basic physical dignity to the young men whose bodies have been so badly damaged in the war. It's interesting that medicine there is, I would say, restorative. These young men return to a culture that has a normative understanding of what a human being should look like and be like, and where medical technology is deployed to try to restore that in the body that's been damaged. The man comes back with one leg having been blown off, and he's provided with a prosthetic leg. So he's almost a two-legged man again. What's interesting, it seems to me, over the last 20, 30 years, is how the restorative dimension of medicine seems to be being eclipsed by the transformative dimension. Think about transgender surgery. Transgender surgery is not restorative. It does not operate with a normative anthropology, a normative physical anthropology that seeks to restore that which should be there but isn't. To be born and a boy and to think that you're a woman trapped in a boy's body is not the same thing as to be born with one leg and wish that one had two legs. We have a normative understanding of what it means to be a human being. Human beings have two legs typically, not one, not three. That's not to say that somebody born with one leg is not a human being. The word normative, very important there. But it's to say that we would look at the person born with one leg and say, there is something missing that should normatively be there. The transgender question is qualitatively different. It is not that the person was born without something that needs to be provided to them. It's that their body is seen as raw material to be transformed into conformity with the convictions of the mind. That's transformative, not restorative. Now, I should add a caveat here and say, underlying my whole talk has been this idea that technology has transformed what it means to be a human being. It seems to me to be difficult where we would draw the line. Does it transform our understanding of human beings that Trueman caught a plane yesterday in Heathrow Airport and was able to arrive in Amsterdam within 50 minutes? Is that restorative or transformative? It seems to me that there are grey areas here. Those grey areas, though, I think can by and large be cleared up if we have that normative anthropology in our minds. How we establish that might be a tricky thing. But again, to return to the problem of this day, what is the problem of this day? We have no normative anthropology beyond the idea that we are free and autonomous. We are inextricably technological. The question is, to what extent do we allow that technology to override normative notions of limits and ends? And it's that question that I want to go to in Lecture 3 tomorrow. Thank you for listening so patiently.